Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. Joining me to discuss the latest on the deteriorating situation in Ukraine is Matthew Dubas, editor of the New Jersey-based publication, the Ukrainian Weekly. The newspaper serves as a major source of news and information for members of the Ukrainian community throughout the United States and Canada. Nice to have you back, Mr. Dubas.
Thank you for having me.
You informed me that there have been a number of significant developments in your country that aren't being reported in many of the mainstream news outlets, and you cited ethnic cleansing as one of the most disturbing stories that is being overlooked. Please explain.
Especially in Crimea, we have reports that the Crimean Tatars, who are the indigenous people of Crimea, they are being targeted by the Russian authorities in Crimea. Their council, the Mejlis, which is their kind of organization that helps foster community involvement, activism, and cultural development, has been targeted by the Russian security forces, the FSB. And they have seized the building. They have confiscated computers, meeting minimums that Russia hosted in 10 different Crimean Tatar, instrumental in organizing their fellow Tatars and Ukrainians to boycott the election. And this was retaliation by the FSB and the Russian authorities. The ethnic cleansing is another chapter that you want to put the historical parallels with Hitler and Putinism. It's easier to do when you see the evidence building up. And unfortunately, we're getting reports that in addition to Crimean Tatars who are being killed and no investigation regarding their deaths or anything like that, but people are being shifted around or being denied work permits, etc. This is just simply targeting anybody who does not go along with the Russian program.
A number of other points you made that I want to go over, so I'll just mention them and you jump right in and kind of give us a little more detail as far as what's going on.
Sure.
Volunteer battalions, specifically I believe they're called Azov, are getting attention for alleged neo-Nazism. What's that about?
It is, I would say, an isolated incident that the Russian media has jumped on and pursued it to their means. And unfortunately, it's getting picked up in the Western media as being widespread. But this is simply a single battalion that has certain members that have extreme right-wing political affiliations. And I think that what will be dangerous in the future is if these people decide to use their military experience and background to further a political career, and for them to really gain momentum. I think that Putin might try to leverage these individuals to political activism as well, and we'll have to keep an eye on that.
German entities with ties to the Russian government, which accounts for 300,000 jobs for Germans in Russia, could be behind the latest disinformation as a response to the next round of sanctions.
Yes, that is correct. There are German companies that do not want to relinquish their economic ties with Russia because it has been such a cash cow for them. They are also perpetuating this Russian propaganda, perpetuating this imagery of painting the Ukrainians as Nazis or neo-Nazi elements among the Ukrainian forces. There are also films being made in Russia and in Russia's little enclave called Kaliningrad, right on the Baltic Sea there, films titled Novorossiya, which is New Russia. It is the name that it is given to the eastern territories of Ukraine that it wants to eventually completely occupy. And these films and footage of this sort of thing is being used in its propaganda tools to show Ukrainians as attacking Russian speakers or anything that furthers their dialogue and narrative.
And a lot of these films are being made in an area known as Kaliningrad?
Kaliningrad, Russia, correct.
And how have you been able to confirm that? Your sources on the ground or sources throughout the region?
This is sources in Russia and in Ukraine itself. These are human rights watch groups that are watching these films and footage and analyzing how even certain news crews that are in Ukraine are being orchestrated to look like they're getting beat up by Ukrainian forces when in fact they're actually being painted up and simply getting into a scuffle, and the makeup does the story, and it's very Hollywood, and you don't understand that it is fake and orchestrated and completely false from reality.
You cited that already a governor in eastern Russia has been replaced for falling out of favor with the presidential administration in Moscow, and cracks are beginning to show within the Moscow circle that surrounds Putin. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, we can even see that this particular oil company manager, Yevtushenko, who owns the company called Bashneft, which is one of the few privately owned oil companies in Russia, is being targeted by Rosneft, the state-owned oil monopoly, to basically, they charge him with money laundering, and they're gonna seize his assets, essentially similar as they did with the Yukos case with Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And now Khodorkovsky was released out of prison, and a lot of people think that it was a goodwill gesture by Putin prior to the Sochi Olympics. And I don't think that anything like that is given from Mr. Yevtushenko. I think he is going to be sitting in prison for a while. He is currently under house arrest, and we're going to follow that and keep you updated on any sort of developments there.
And what is the Vostok battalion, and how do they factor into all of the conflict that's taking place in your country?
The Vostok battalion is a Russian militant group that is not legally registered, so that whatever crimes they commit cannot be really traced back to Russia, and no one can really be charged for their crimes. A lot of that is also true on the Ukrainian side, where some of these battalions that are formed are not legally registered, so they're not necessarily acting under the direct orders of the Ukrainian government. So this also limits what kind of arms they get, what kind of funding they get, and what kind of legal protection they get.
Doesn't it also make it hard to distinguish the good guys from the bad guys?
It muddies the water considerably. These people can dress up in the Ukrainian military's uniform and commit crimes and then claim it was the Ukrainians when really it was the Russians. It's all part of the disinformation campaign.
And if I'm not mistaken, a similar tactic was used in pre-World War II by the KGB, which I think at the time was known as the NKVD.
That's correct. This is a continuation of Soviet tactics that was used against the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. These were World War II, pre-World War II, and post-World War II nationalist movements that ended up as partisan fighters. And a lot of the crimes that were attributed to these organizations as being Nazi collaborators, etc., was based on the KGB or NKVD dressed up as these Ukrainian partisans committing crimes either against Jews or local population to paint them in a bad light.
Now, when explaining the situation involving family you have back in Ukraine, you indicated they are very worried and are thinking of leaving the area.
These are Russian troops. This is not Ukrainian forces. They're assumptions that you're the quote-unquote separatists. So the question is, where do these people go? And a lot of them have gone to the west, but now some of them have started to return, especially in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. Apparently over 40,000 refugees have begun to return to these areas. Not sure if related to the ceasefire. It could be, and I guess we'll get into that in a little bit.
And as far as pro-Russia rebels in sections of the country, what are the specific areas that they've taken a stronghold on?
Currently, they only hold 1/3 of the territories in Luhansk and Donetsk regions. The rest is actually Ukrainian controlled, but they still claim control of the whole thing. The special status that they've been granted by the Ukrainian parliament has mixed reaction. It's sort of seen as a betrayal by some, and I guess a way for Russia to leverage power against Kiev. It's also seen as a concession to the West so that the peace process can, I guess, get started and dialogue. And unfortunately, the political process has, if not more cost than the military campaign, both in human counting and in financial accounting.
And at this point, with regard to Russian troops, are there still a significant amount on the border?
Yes, especially in Rostov-on-Don. That is considered a training area for these Russian troops who are being told that they're going on a training exercise, and then sooner or later they end up in Ukraine and they don't know how they got there.
We also noted that refugees from Ukraine who have arrived in Russia are being put on planes and taken to areas thousands of miles from the intended destination in the Siberian wilderness without explanation from Russia. What's that about?
This is another disturbing event that is unfortunately not getting enough coverage. Human rights groups in Ukraine are reporting that refugees in Russia are being moved to Magadan, Kolyma, Sakhalin, and Kamchatka. These are all in the far east of Siberia. These are typical areas that the Soviets would use to, quote-unquote, repopulate the area with anybody who they thought was a problem. This all spurred on because in Rostov, where there was a number of Ukrainian refugees who refused to leave, Russia has started to implement what they call voluntary settlement by compatriots living abroad.
And you cite it has a frightening parallel to the Crimean Tatars who were exiled to Central Asia in 1944 by Stalin.
That is correct. This is a continuation of Soviet policy.
Can you confirm reports that gays and Jews are not being allowed into Crimea and other sections of Ukraine?
I can confirm things like that, but even more disturbing is that people who are on certain medications, such as HIV treatments or similar, are being denied their treatments. Even drug addicts who require certain medicines to combat withdrawal effects, they're being denied their medications as well, simply to, I guess, foster these people to commit suicide or something like that, to the point where it's not the Russian government's problem anymore. These people should just get busy and die.
And that is primarily because Russia now controls Crimea.
That is correct.
And so the Ukrainian government virtually has no say-so.
It is simply Russian controlled. It is, I guess, a preview of what to expect in Donetsk and Luhansk if Russian separatists are allowed to maintain control.
If President Putin moves forward with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, what areas is he likely to target first?
He's probably likely to move in either out from Crimea to the east to build a land bridge so that he can supply Crimea. Otherwise, this idea of building a bridge through the Kerch Strait is a dead end for him because he knows that it's impossible to build due to the weather and erosion that would face a project like this. Plus, he doesn't have the money.
Ukraine President Petro Poroshenko recently traveled to America as part of a special tour. What can you tell us about the purpose of the trip and the reaction of Ukrainian Americans had to his visit?
I would say that the Ukrainian Americans were very positive in receiving President Poroshenko. I think people were a little dismayed that the U.S. was not as on board with arming Ukraine, but simply giving them money for humanitarian assistance and security sectors. But I think overall it was positive. I think that the president spoke very directly and openly with the Congress, and I think that the people who heard his message understand what the country has gone through and respect the way that Ukraine has handled the situation, trying to limit human casualties and displacement of people.
I recently taped an episode with former producer of ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, Mr. Tom Osborne, and I posed the question, if Putin proceeds with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, would it be likely that the U.S. would send American troops in? And he said it was his hope that it wouldn't get to that point, but there was a very strong possibility that American boots could be on the ground. Do you agree with Mr. Osborne?
I believe that the U.S. will play some sort of role in the coalition of forces similar to, as was discovered during this post-NATO summit in Wales. It would be a coalition against Putin, an anti-Putin coalition, I guess. And like similarly, this NATO exercise, Rapid Trident, that is going on in western Ukraine right now, which involves 1,300 troops from 15 different countries. I think something similar will work against Putin, where it doesn't necessarily require unanimity for NATO to make these decisions or for the U.S. to simply lead by itself. It would be a bunch of countries working together and not necessarily having everybody required to be on board. It's people who are willing to be on board.
And how confident are you that additional sanctions against Russia will work?
It has worked to a point. So far, I think the ruble has dropped below 38 to a dollar for the first time ever, and these are positive signs. But no one has ever won a military action simply through sanctions. We can expect a frozen conflict zone similar to North Korea.
What's the latest on the investigation into the downing of Malaysian flight MH17?
Interpreter Mag reports that there are 3 possible locations of where the Buk missile could have been fired from within Ukraine. One is in Torres, where the plane actually crashed not too far from there. There's another area, sister city called Snezhnoye, that's also just next door to Torres, and then there's another city called Chernuikhino. Now, journalists have spoken to residents who say that Buk traveled through the city. Other videos appeared to show the Buk was 24 kilometers away from the city, but moving in that direction. Now, in Snezhnoye, a video showed the Buk had been geolocated in the town. 2 AP journalists and a Ukrainian journalist reported seeing the Buk in the city on July 17th, the day the MH17 was shot down. So there's at least conclusive evidence that one Buk traveled within the Torres Snezhnoye area and the same day that the airline was shot down. Since then, journalists have spoken to residents who say the Buk traveled through the town. And the third city is a bit less conclusive because there's varying reports on where the missiles came from. There's a lack of reporting. The way that the timeline roughly knew that these military forces to man these units, the Ukrainian military had all of their units accounted for and none of their crews had been known to defect or anything like that. So all the fears really point to Russia.
And as far as the crash site, are investigators still having difficulty obtaining access?
Yes. The OS is in charge with securing the area so that the Dutch investigators can continue with their investigation. This has been an ongoing process of shifting the border back and forth, listening to where the mortar fire is coming from, retreating, going back to the site. They said that the local population doesn't understand that nothing in the site can be moved, and yet farmers are trying to plant their crops, the soil is being turned over, and the entire crime scene is basically compromised.
Is there anything you'd like to say? Please take this opportunity to do so.
I think that the dialogue in the United States is headed in the wrong direction because we fail to recognize what Russia is doing in Ukraine as an invasion. There is failure to identify what things are going on in Ukraine. We have this unhealthy fear of offending Russia, and I think that we should really buck up and stand up to Russia. Otherwise, this is something that we will have to deal with for a very long time. And I think Europe especially has to point the finger at Russia and get tough on the situation and not necessarily, like they have done, defer to Russia, especially with this deep, comprehensive free trade agreement that Ukraine and the European Union were supposed to sign. Russia was somehow invited to the negotiations, and they were the ones that pressed that Ukraine delay this agreement until the end of 2015. Now, how can Ukraine be considered independent if even the European Union is allowing Russia to have a say on when it signs a free trade agreement with the European Union? This is completely incongruent.
Why do you think not just America, but other countries are so reluctant to hold Russia's feet to the fire?
Right now, because there is no alternative for energy sources with an approaching winter, I think that nobody wants to upset that boat right now. I think once the European Union can foster a pipeline across that bypasses Russia, things might be a little different, but Russia might have its own plans, and who knows, might try to invade some of these Central Asian republics that have some sort of Russian ethnic population that needs protection. Similar with the Baltics as they've threatened. And the question is, if Russia does enter these Baltic states or NATO member states, is NATO and the European Union and the United States and Canada, are they prepared to retaliate in an appropriate fashion, rather than dragging things out and making the conflict longer than it has to be.
Sounds like that'll be opening the door to a war, don't you think?
The war is already here, whether we like to acknowledge it or not.
Thank you for taking the time to update us, Mr. Dubas. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the G-Man Interviews. I'm the G-Man, and I thank you for joining me. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.